what I want to talk about today is photography, and I'll explain that picture in a minute. But to tell you the truth, and I'll sit for some of this, I struggled putting the presentation together because initially my thought was, well, I need to talk about issues relevant to Kazakhstan, and I need to be familiar with this country and photography here. This is the first time I've been in Kazakhstan for about 15 hours now. So I struggled with this, and then I realized that, in fact, that was a mistake. In fact, the point of my presentation is what I should do is show you the kind of work I do and show you the community of photography that I'm around in New York and internationally, both in terms of some historical images, but also in terms of some contemporary images. The clicker's not working, so I'm going to have to walk over. This is, I'm lucky. You know, the last speaker was talking about finding your passion. I found my passion as a university student taking pictures and was able to sort of monetize that passion and spent 20 years traveling internationally taking pictures. And this was a picture, you've recently had an experience here with demonstrations. This was a demonstration in Detroit, which is the city I'm from, when the United States invaded Kuwait en route to Iraq a very long time ago. And I had taken a few pictures before this, but I had never really thought about a career in photography or photojournalism. But this experience so radicalized me and was so exciting that it set me on a career path. And to complicate, the person being arrested is the student reporter I was with. And it's a long story, and I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this picture, other to say that this was really what set me, or set a career in motion that has now taken me in photography for 25 years. And really what I want to talk about today, and let me go back to the other image, is this idea that, you know, photography is sort of magical in a way. And I think now, more than any previous time, the combination of your phones and what your phones can do with photography and social media makes it a powerful, powerful tool, agent for change, at a time when I think globally we need such an agent for change, right? We have climate issues, we have increasing totalitarian governments, we have rapidly changing ideas of gender and diversity and race and discrimination. And I think photography is a tool that can really bring people together around these issues. This image is the first digital image ever. That's a scan of an American scientist, and I have jet lag, so I can't remember his name, did a scan of a photograph. So 1957, a scan of his infant son. That scan, and I assume most of you have some idea of what this means. That scan was 172 pixels by 172 pixels, right? Because that's all the computer could hold. And this is in, for some of the people in your room, not quite for me, this is in a lifetime, a generation. So this, by contrast, can create pictures that are 3,000 by 4,000 pixels across. Easily, right? This, by contrast, has more computing power than did either the Russian, the Soviet, or the American space programs for the first 15 years of those programs. It is extraordinary what you hold in your hand. And, you know, there was historically, an earlier kind of equally significant development in media, and that was the Gutenberg printing press. But even that printing press took sort of 200 years from the time it was developed into the time that it became routinely used to print newspapers. The change in media, I should put it around my neck. The change in media is happening in your lifetime, right? The picture I showed you, this was taken with a black and white film camera. You can actually see kind of the glue from the darkroom in the corner. So in my professional lifetime, we've gone from that to my phone, which is actually a better camera, right? So in the context of that, in the context of how important photography is as a tool, your interest in photography, the global kind of potential for change and good that photography can do, particularly mobile photography, I want to show you a bunch of pictures today. Sound good? Okay. So, and I have this is basically a story in 3 parts, 3 overarching points I want to make to you. And I'm going to try and move through this pretty quickly so there's time for questions at the end. But you know, the previous speaker, John, was talking about if you have something you want to do, find people to network with, come network with me, right? So if you're interested in photo or journalism, I'll be here all weekend. Come see me. I have a big stack of business cards, right? So the first part of my presentation is this. Photography is a language, right? And it is a unique language in a lot of ways that we're going to discuss, but it's unique mostly because it is a global language. We don't have to share a spoken or written language to understand photography. You don't even have to be literate to understand photography, and we can communicate through photography. That makes it a unique tool. The second is basically this, right? You ain't seen nothing yet in terms of change, and I think what photography and what these tools are going to mean. And I'll show you some examples. And I'm doing other workshops. I'm doing a workshop on animations and a workshop on Instagram. If you want, you know, come check them out. And the third thing I want to share with you today is story's everything. In other words, after a certain point, the tools don't matter unless you can inhabit those tools with real human stories, with yourself, right? And that is one of the things I really want to challenge you to think through, and as we're looking at pictures, for you to take away from the pictures we look at. Not all the pictures I'm going to show are going to appeal to everybody, but some will appeal to you. And I'm going to, so, Jorge Luis Borges is an Argentinian writer, and thank you. And he's sort of a fantastical writer, right? He's very philosophical. His writing, poetry, essays, short stories, it's very mystical. There are lots of mirrors and labyrinths and deep ultra meanings. So the story goes, in 1940, he read an essay written by an English Enlightenment era scientist. And he was so sort of incensed by the idea that this Enlightenment era scientist thought that we could develop one universal code, one universal language to understand everything, almost like HTML, right? And his argument, and he created this thing called the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge, which I'll explain in a second. And he was so incensed by the idea that human beings are exclusively rational animals, that everything could be explained in a single taxonomy. His fear was that culture would be lost, right? The variety of human artistry would be lost. So he developed the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge, which is this sort of weird taxonomy of seemingly unrelated things, right? And there's a lot of philosophical conversation around this thing. What are the patterns? What are the meanings? And it gets pretty mystical pretty quickly. Why am I telling you all this? Because what I want to share with you is sort of a celestial emporium of benevolent photography. So I'm going to show you about 25 pictures from, some are old, some are new, some are mobile, some are more traditional photo. And the denominators, I think, in these pictures I'm going to show you are that they're going to illustrate these 3 basic things I'm hoping you're going to take away from this, right? Photo's a language, you ain't seen nothing yet, and none of it matters if you can't find your own voice, either as Kazakhs or individually, to tell your story, right? Sound good? And the one takeaway I hope that you do from this as you go through these pictures is find out, sort of begin to deconstruct the pictures. Look at some of these images and decide if they speak to you and try and figure out what is working with them. Because I will tell you what does not work online, what is not going to make for change, what is not going to use photo as a tool are more selfies and stupid memes, right? So to some extent, if you can find a more sophisticated voice in this language of photography, you can affect more change. You can find a more satisfying personal expression. Sound good? All right. This is Henri Cartier-Bresson, French photographer, sort of an aristocrat, and he was first a surrealist painter, and then he became a photographer. And this is, the other reason that I've selected these images is these are all images that in the last 6 months I've talked to somebody about it. They've come up in conversation, which is just my way of sort of staying fresh, to know that what I'm talking about is still relevant as I shoot less and teach more. So Bresson is one of the fathers of photography, without a doubt, right? He's one of the pillars. And if you're interested in photography, you probably know him. If you don't know his work, you should know his work. And if people are interested, maybe I can do a list of all the photographers I show, just so you can get a sense. And what Bresson is most known for, in terms of, in addition to this sort of surrealism, is the idea of a decisive moment, right? If you look at the boy in the background and the glint on the glass, this picture was taken in an instant, right? A moment later, it disappears. Make sense? Right? The other reason that I chose this picture to start with is photography is a language. How could you write what you see in this picture? How could you talk about what you see in this picture? You can. It's an idea that only works as a picture. Photography is its own unique language. You need to speak that language. And I think one of the things for me, I do a lot of work at home with reporters. And one of the things that happens with reporters, who now, of course, in American journalism need to take pictures with their mobiles, is they want to take pictures like they write stories. They think it's a direct translation of language, from writing to taking pictures, and it's not. It's a very, very different language, right? That's a great picture. That's a mobile picture, right? And it was actually taken for Apple as part of their campaign of pictures. This was taken in Singapore by an amateur photographer. But I like this one too, because this is something else. This is a moment. How could you write that? How could you articulate that? It's almost like a dance or a poem, right? The sort of the lyrical pattern of the nets and the men fishing. That's a beautiful photograph, right? That's an aerial photograph by a guy named Vincent Lafleur, who's the New York Times photographer. Whenever the New York Times needs a helicopter picture, now they do more drones, they have Vincent do it. And Vincent took this picture, and it's become so renowned now that MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, bought a copy of this picture from him to hang in his permanent collection, because it's such an unusual new view of what photography could be. So, if this picture is sort of from the air looking down, this one is the reverse, right? And this is, I don't know if people here are familiar with a social network called Reddit, right? So this kind of floated up to the top on Reddit. And this is about as social media photo as you can get, right? It's a square format. That's a big deal if you're a photographer, and we'll talk more about that. Whether you're shooting vertical, horizontal, or square, that is something to be very aware of. And the conversation I had about this picture was what a great moment it is because of the plane, how smart that is, but how well the construction works as a square, right? Okay, people are nodding, so I'm hoping this is making sense, right? Okay. So this is by a guy named András Kertész, a Hungarian photographer. Early 20th century, I was at a friend's house the other night having dinner. He worked for Kertész as a young man, as an assistant, so he had a print of this picture. And I just found myself staring at it the whole night, right? There's just something, it's called Lost Cloud, right? I mean, I don't know why I shared it. I'm just sharing it because I think it's a remarkable picture. And I think like any of the pictures I'm showing, this is obviously an older film picture. There's nothing here you couldn't do with a mobile, right? The genius here is the concept. It's not the tools. So again, I just want to drive home this idea that photography is a language, that the first language human beings used was imagery, right? And it was the Egyptian image for an ox that ultimately became the Aleph and the Roman numeral A, right? And now arguably Android and Apple, right? In other words, my point to you is we are wired, and I'll skip ahead a little bit, the visual cortex, that's connected to your eyes. That's where information that your eyes collect in photographs or painting is stored and processed. The interior cortex and the three other lobes That's where other kinds of written, spoken language material are processed. In other words, your brain works differently with visual information. And it always has. Thousands of years ago, before we had written languages, we were already doing this. Oops, sorry. We were doing this. Now, there's theories that actually the visual cortex is developing more as we consume. In New York, theories go that I'm exposed to 500,000 images a day, right? It's probably not dissimilar here for you either on phones. And that is changing, arguably, the way brain functions. And there's been research. This is from a woman named Mary Meeker. She does these annual media reports. And this is her report, which was exclusively on mobile in 2016. And what she's saying is basically most of you communicate visually. You talk through images, right? Which is different than, I think, a generation ago, where images were designed like Lost Cloud. You put up Lost Cloud and people would talk about Lost Cloud. Now we have conversations through images. And I think part of being a social media photographer is understanding that and harnessing that in the kinds of pictures you take. Check out the number of likes. How many of you have seen this picture? Right? A lot of you. So it's an egg. 50 million likes for an egg. Why? Because this picture is part of a conversation on Instagram. I think it was Kylie Jenner, celebrities, athletes, they're always going to blow up Instagram. Can't compete with that, right? But the photographer who shot this, basically it was a campaign to get more likes than Kylie Jenner, right? And she did. And my point to you is, it started a whole conversation online, right? And this is the way I think how photography is a language. Like any language, it evolves, and part of that evolution now is figuring out how to engage people on Instagram and other platforms to have conversations, rather than just taking, it's almost like images that are questions or images that beg a response, rather than images that are statements. Does that make sense? And I think if you begin to think that way, your photography becomes much more engaging online. How am I doing on time? I'm doing good. So, funny picture. This guy, his name, one of the guys I teach with is a photo editor and runs a blog for the New York Times, and they just ran, I get his name wrong. I always want to say his name. His name's Daniel Arnold, and he's a street photographer. And this, I think, is another big trend in photography that I see in New York, and maybe it's here too, but it's something to be aware of. So first, it's a funny photo. It's street photo. Funny photos are worth $1 million, right? Humor in photography is part of the language. But what's interesting about this guy, and another trend in photo, around which there's a lot of online conversation, are trends where the photographers are using film cameras to take pictures and then scanning in those film cameras, like that very first image we looked at. So Arnold he uses disposable cameras, right? And people talk about him, and I would encourage you on Instagram or elsewhere, if you like this style of imagery, as opposed to a more formal kind of imagery that we've seen with some of the more classic photographers, you should check him out, because he's getting a lot of attention because he's got such a unique eye for wit and humor in his photography, right? Rather than just, here is my latte kind of pictures. He's telling a little story with his images. Animations. Food photography, to begin with, is huge, and a way that people contact each other. There are communities around food. Food is intensely personal. It's intensely cultural. There's a lot of things you can do with food. This, and I don't know if people can see it, and we'll, again, in the animation workshop, we'll talk about this. This is actually just a series of 8 different images stuck together and played in a loop. And that's essentially what a GIF is, an animation is. So this is a really, really easy thing to produce. And this is an example, and I don't have to tell you, I assume GIFs and animations are huge online, right? And they're sort of a natural extension, I think, of photography. They're a way of sort of expanding the vocabulary of photography. And if this is an image of sort of photo working its way toward video in a way. This next one, this is a video where an algorithm has been used in a very, very simple application called Photograph to give animation to the flames. That is easy to do, right? And the argument is, and this is how I think about photo now, and this is how you should think about photo. I didn't show any slides sort of explaining why you should care about photo in a social media context, because you should know. It's just my figure, if you don't know, you got a problem, right? It is fundamentally a visual medium. I tell my students now, look, the first job of any image you take is when I'm scrolling through my feed, it's got to be an image that's going to stop somebody, right? And if you're a journalist or you've got other content, that image is your point of entry for your other content. In other words, strong imagery is key to whatever message you want to bring into the world in social media. So these next two images are two other really interesting things that are changing now in imagery. So this is, first, environmental stories. Like, I used to, in award ceremonies, you wouldn't see very often, you'd see an occasional fire, but you wouldn't see things about environmental stories. I'm seeing a lot of environmental stories now. So one of the things when we talk about stories is for you to find themes that interest you and a community around those themes and stay with them, right? So this, my point is, with an SLR, for me to take a close-up like this requires specialized equipment. One of the things with your phone is it will take pictures 3 inches away, no problem. This is changing what is called the liminal distance. In other words, one of the things that's new for you and new for you with a mobile tool is this ability to take close-ups easily. That is something, change is good. Things that are different is good. Things that will make people stop when they're going through their feed are all good. And I think the ability to do close-ups is one of those things. Well, there's another workshop on this later, drone photography. That's another huge emerging area. And this is another, sort of melting ice caps, and the effect on wildlife is how it's being expressed here. But I think this is another powerful image and another powerful new way that the tool of photography is being used to engage and tell stories. I don't expect most of you will recognize this guy. He's an American football player, and he's African American. And race relations in the United States are fraught, to say the least. And he took a knee. He refused to stand during a football game for the national anthem. And they fired him as a football player. He's been blacklisted. He can't play professional football any longer. So this has become, irrespective of how you feel about this has become a very, very important social justice issue in the United States. And why am I sharing this? Because this one picture embodies several other trends which I think are kind of interesting. One is the photographer who took this picture is a photographer named Platon. He's a very, very famous portrait photographer. Number two, it's an ad, right? It's a social justice message, but it's advertising. And one of the things that Mary Meeker is talking about around stories is this increasing confluence between corporate interests and human interests. And I think that in the future is one of those things we're going to have to navigate. The other reason I'm showing you this picture is that is a vertical, right? That's a strong vertical. That is designed to be looked at on your phone, right? This whole campaign assumes you'll be looking, because people, vertical video, we can talk about it later, people don't hold their phones horizontally, they hold it vertically. And the way to get the most real estate, the most use out of your space, are vertical images like this. So I would, sort of low-hanging fruit to better photography, think about how your images are going to be used and hold the phone appropriately. I won't go into this one, but another big development, I'm guessing most of you are aware of this, we'll talk about it in the animation workshop, but social stories, photo-based social stories, Instagram stories, Snapchat stories, there may be other platforms that are engaging them here, but even big news organizations are beginning to get involved in those. Let me see if it'll... Well, I won't play it, but basically you can see it's several images sandwiched together into a effectively little video as an animation that tell the story of exploring the solar system. So one of the things to think about with photo as you move forward are multiple images in photo story format. Good? Huge, huge, huge. And I look, you know, when I was going to do this presentation using a lot of Kazakh imagery, I began to look at some archives, historical pictures from Kazakhstan. You are sitting on a treasure trove of extraordinary images from the past, right? And there is a huge movement now in photo to revisit those, repurpose those. So that's a picture from when the very famous Flatiron Building was being built in the early 20th century. This is a picture I took. And it only works on your mobile, but that little curtain will allow me to roll back and forth, right? And these are wildly, archival images in a huge variety of ways are wildly popular these days. And again, I think, you know, when I say popular, these are things where there's proven engagement, where, you know, the creators or the feeds or all their stats, all their metrics show that they are getting more more viewers because they're employing some of these techniques. This site was so popular that they actually retroactively published a book, right? So this is not a happy story, but I think it's extraordinary. This Brazilian photographer took families back to a place where they had a family portrait before one of the family members was disappeared during the 70s by the despotic governments that ran much of South America. That is extremely powerful, right? So I'm zooming through the rest of this, and I'm going to run out of time. But if you have questions, please come see me. So kind of in closing, really quickly, and this is sort of the third chapter, which is if there isn't real story, it doesn't matter. And one of the things that's happening is mobile phone sales are declining. But mobile phones themselves are getting much more robust in terms of some of the things they can do. This picture, you could take this picture now with a mobile, right? Notice how the background is soft. There are now filters that allow you to do that. This picture ran on the cover of National Geographic because this child was born a boy but identifies as female. I think that's a beautiful portrait around an extraordinarily important issue, no matter how you feel about it. If the idea here is to use photo to have a conversation, that's a conversation starter. That's a beautiful picture. Right? This is a picture by Steve McCurry of India. That's cinematic. That's a beautiful picture. But it's also, the theory now goes, a very colonial interpretation of India. Right? Rajiv Singh is an Indian photographer, and this is how he sees his country, right? As somebody who grew up there. So one of the messages now, and this has changed in my lifetime, why send me any longer, an American photographer, to the Caucasus or to North Africa or any region to take pictures? Why shouldn't those people tell their own stories to international audiences? Why do you need me to be an interpreter? And I think this is one of the things for Central Asia, because my suspicion is things are going to change here quickly. And for you to control that narrative for yourselves, I think is hugely important. Right? These I'm just going to skip because we're going to run out of time. This is a World Press Award-winning photo. This is a photo by a Brazilian photographer who was found on Instagram, hired by Time to shoot a series of influential women. These are all shot with her mobile phone. Right? These are all mobile photographs. Her name is Luisa Dor. These were also shot on mobile by a photographer named Danielle Zockman, and she used filters to wed two images together. And lastly, this is a former student who's working in Afghanistan, and I'm closing it out kind of quickly now, but he's worked in Afghanistan for a long time. He's Cuban, and he's very frustrated. And his mission in Afghanistan is not to basically do what we call war porn, but to try and really photograph community and life and how people in countries like Afghanistan live their daily lives. That's a beautiful image, right? That's a humanizing image. Similarly, this is a Native American photographer. And what I like about this, I was on a committee, we're gonna give her an award. And it's a beautiful photograph because of the light, but it's sort of a moment between moments. You may be Frida Kahlo is a famous Mexican painter. And this is in Dallas, Texas, and thousands of young women dress up like Frida Kahlo. It's a festival every year, so she had to photograph it for the newspaper. And this was the photograph the newspaper ran, which is really kind of interesting because it's sort of an intimate moment between these two girls who happen to be sisters, a moment between moments. And I think that is part of a more complicated vocabulary in photography that we use now. And this one, I took it, and it's with a mobile, and I liked it, so I thought I'd include it. And this, I'm guessing you've all seen this one, right? And in closing, that is my message to you, right? Photography is an extraordinary tool. Don't take it for granted. Figure out how to have a voice as a culture and as individuals here, and enjoy it. And if you want to talk about sort of how the world works and how to monetize this, happy to talk to you later. Thank you very much. Yeah.